Hi, my name is Evan, and welcome to part 3 in my video series on the history of comic book films. This one will be covering the 1980s. My first video covered the very first comic book films, serials of the 40s and 50s. My second video was about the 60s and 70s and the birth of the modern superhero movie era with the Batman and Superman films. Those two characters dominated that era, and they basically dominated the 80s as well. The 80s were not that kind of comic book films, though. They were coming more frequently than before, that's for sure, but most were still pretty low quality. There were a couple exceptions, and the decade did start and end on significant high notes, and those are involving those two characters, Batman and Superman. The first one, the high note that the 80s started out on, was the sequel to the highly successful 1978 film Superman. It was just called Superman 2 and came out in 1980. It brought back Christopher Reeve in the title role, and supposedly large parts of the movie were actually shot at the same time as the first film. Apparently, I've heard around 75% of the film was shot by Richard Donner, the director of the first film. The Salkinds, who, as I talked about in the previous video, were producing the films, decided to replace Donner with Richard Lester. Lester was most well known for directing films for the Beatles, actually, A Hard Day's Night and Help. He also directed the 1967 film How I Won the War, which featured John Lennon. He had also worked with the Salkinds before in the 1973 adaptation of The Three Musketeers. Lester was selected to bring a more slapstick approach, which you may recognize from the Beatles movies Help and Hard Day's Night. And this was instead of Donner's comparatively serious take. Donner and the Salkinds had clashed during the production of the first film, as the Salkinds wanted a more campy approach. And an interesting note is, according to the IMDb trivia page for Superman 2, Lester claimed that he had never even heard of Superman before agreeing to work on the film. Superman 2 brought back Margot Kidder as Lois Lane and Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor. New to the series was Terrence Stamp, who played the villain General Zod. He had earned an Oscar nomination in 1962 for Best Supporting Actor in Billy Budd, and he's also worked with lots of notable directors like Federico Fellini, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Steven Soderbergh, and Oliver Stone. He also, you may know him from his role in The Phantom Menace as Supreme Chancellor Valorum. Scenes were shot for Superman 2 with Marlon Brando as Jor-El, but they were not used to avoid paying his exorbitant fee. In addition, Gene Hackman did not participate in the reshoots because he was unhappy with the fact that Donner had been fired. They actually eventually released the Richard Donner cut on DVD in 2006. The film was very well received, and it's currently got an 89% on the Rotten Tomatoes tomato meter and an 87 out of 100 on Metacritic. It was very successful at the box office as well, making over $100 million, which was around double the budget. So I'm not really that big of a fan of the Superman series in general, but this is definitely a solid, entertaining film. This one and the first Superman were definitely better, in my opinion, than any of the Superman films that followed, and that included Superman Returns and Man of Steel. And it was also, definitely Superman 2 was very influential on the superhero film genre. Moving on, next year in 1981, there was one comic book movie, the animated film Heavy Metal. Heavy Metal was actually the name of an American comic magazine which featured science fiction and fantasy stories. It was based on a French magazine named Metal Hurlant. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. But Heavy Metal featured some pretty famous artists like H.R. Geiger and Mobius, And there was also lots of violence and sex in a lot of the works they published, which definitely crossed over to the movie version. The 81 film was based on a few different stories from the periodical. And like I mentioned, true to the source material, there's plenty of graphic violence and nudity. The director was a guy named Gerald Potterton, who was an animator on one of my favorite movies of all time, Yellow Submarine. They also had many decently famous actors as part of the voice cast, such as John Candy, Eugene Levy, and Harold Ramis. They also had a bunch of pretty popular rock bands from the era on the soundtrack, like Black Sabbath, Cheap Trick, Stevie Nicks, Devo, and Journey. The film has got some pretty excellent animation, and that includes some rotoscoping, some early use of that technique. And it's become a kind of a cult classic over the years. It's decently entertaining to watch. Obviously, it's cheesy and it's not without its flaws, but it's worth checking out. And it was also spoofed by South Park in an episode titled Major Boobage. Next year, 1982, the only comic book movie to be released was Swamp Thing, based on the DC character created by Len Wein and Bemi Wrightson in 1971. The film version was directed by Wes Craven, who you probably have heard of, I assume, if you're watching this video. He's known for films such as Nightmare on Elm Street, Last House on the Left, and The Hills Have Eyes. The film starred Dick Durock as the titular character, Adrienne Barbeau, and Ray Wise, who played Leland Palmer on Twin Peaks. Then in 1983, we returned to the Christopher Reeve Superman series. The Saul Kynes released Superman 3, which, in my opinion, and I think most people's opinion, marked the beginning of the decline of the franchise. Pretty steep decline. Richard Lester from the second film returned to direct. Critics and audiences definitely gave it a much worse reception than the previous two films. Right now, on Rotten Tomatoes, it has 26% approval rating. It had a budget of $39 million, and it made around $70 million worldwide, so technically not a failure, but not a huge success either. As I said previously in the video, I'm not a huge fan of the Superman series in general, but there's definitely a significant step down in quality from Superman 2 to 3. A big problem with Superman 3 is just it was too campy and too comedic. It just got way too silly. The first two films had their moments that were funny or comedic, but they were balanced out by also serious parts. A big problem that a lot of people had is Richard Pryor had a supporting role, who's obviously very talented, but many felt he was out of place in the series, and I can't say I blame them. And the first few minutes of the movie starts out with Richard Pryor in an unemployment office, so you could be, you might be confused as if you walked in the wrong theater or something at the time. Also, Margot Kidder from the first two films had a reduced role due to her complaining about Richard Donner being fired. Okay, so next year, 1984, this year saw the release of a film called Sheena, directed by John Guillermin, who was also the director of the 1976 version of King Kong. The character of Sheena was created by Will Eisner, a very famous comic artist who's known for creating The Spirit, along with Jerry Iger. She was actually, interestingly enough, the first female comic book character with her own title. Unfortunately, the film bombed pretty badly, and it made less than $6 million on a budget of about $25 million, and it got nominated for 5 Golden Raspberry Awards. Also that year, we have Supergirl, directed by Jeannot Swark. This was a spin-off of the Superman series. It starred Helen Slater as Supergirl in her first film role. There's some other kind of famous people in it. Peter O'Toole, Mia Farrow, and Faye Dunaway appeared in supporting parts, so pretty good supporting cast there. And random kind of fact here, Dolly Parton was actually offered a role, but she turned it down because she didn't want to play a witch. Christopher Reeve was also supposed to cameo as Superman, but this ended up falling through. Like many of the comic book films in the 80s, Supergirl was a critical and commercial failure. It cost about $35 million to make, and it only made $14 million, making it the smallest box office gross of any of the Superman series films. Another comic book film released this year was a film called The Perils of Gwendoline in the Land of the Yik Yak, and it was a French sexploitation movie directed by Just Jakin. 1985, we have the production of Red Sonja, based on the Marvel character that first appeared in Conan the Barbarian in 1973. Richard Fleischer, known for Tora Tora Tora, was the director. Red Sonja is played by model Bridget Nielsen, who was in Rocky IV, Beverly Hills Cop 2. Arnold Schwarzenegger appeared in a supporting capacity that was kind of suspiciously similar to his Conan the Barbarian role. Again, this film, box office disaster, making less than $7 million. Arnold even ended up calling it the worst movie he ever made, and joked that he threatened his kids with watching it if they acted up. Among other problems, Red Sonja was kind of considered to be homophobic due to the villain's she was a lesbian. Okay, so also released that year was Weird Science, which is one that a lot of people may not even realize is a comic book adaptation, and was actually probably the most successful comic book adaptation of that decade that didn't involve Batman or Superman. It's directed by John Hughes, who gained fame in the 80s from directing teen movies like 16 Candles, Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. He also wrote Pretty in Pink, Vacation, Home Alone. Weird Science featured actors like Anthony Michael Hall and Robert Downey Jr., and it was produced by Joel Silver, who later made The Matrix and Die Hard. Weird Science was originally a science fiction anthology comic book published by EC Comics in the 1950s. A story featured in the periodical called Made of the Future by Al Feldstein was the basis of the film. Also, there was another Asterisk adaptation that came out in 1985 called Asterisk vs. Caesar. Fast forward to next year, and we have one of the most infamous comic book movies ever made, Howard the Duck. This is another one that many people might not even realize is a comic book movie. Howard the Duck was a Marvel character created by Guy Gerber in 1973. Howard doesn't have any superpowers, but he's proficient in the martial art known as Quack Fu. The comic series has been called existentialist, something that I would say has definitely been lost in translation. Gerber created that Albert Camus was, quote-unquote, directly responsible for the creation of Howard the Duck. The film version was produced by George Lucas of Star Wars, and it was just a very terrible film that failed on pretty much every level. It received harshly negative reviews, and it tanked at the box office. It was actually supposed to be animated originally, which probably would have been a much better medium for it than live action. I mean, it's a movie about a talking duck from another dimension. Maybe animation, especially at the time in the 80s, would have been better. The adaptation changed Howard's personality, making him much nicer than in the comics, and it removed a lot of the satirical and surrealist elements that made the comic work. Interestingly, the character of Howard the Duck got a cameo in the after-credits scene of the 2014 film Guardians of the Galaxy. So this could be hinting at the character maybe having a bigger role in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the future, or it could just be a quick throwaway joke for the fans. But having said that, making that CGI model must have taken some time, so I don't know if they would have done that for nothing. So, just some context here. This, along with Red Sonja, were actually the first Marvel movies since the 1940s. From the 40s to the 80s, DC pretty much completely dominated in film, and they pretty much dominated in TV as well, with the popular Superman and Batman shows. And, you know, maybe there was a few Marvel cartoons in there, but nothing really live action, and definitely nothing as popular as anything DC. But with that in mind, DC's dominance was basically built around Batman and Superman. And in terms of film, that's something that continues to this day. You know, there's major DC heroes that are only going to be seen in next year in Batman vs. Superman, like Wonder Woman and Aquaman, never been seen in live action before. Green Lantern, another major character, only seen in the past few years. The Flash, never seen in film, only has a TV show. And then you look at Marvel, on the other hand, which they, you know, in this time period in the 80s seemed so far behind, but now they've got, you know, characters like Rocket Raccoon have been on screen before Wonder Woman. So, just kind of interesting to compare the two situations and how they've changed over the years. Another 86 comic book adaptation, which was much higher quality, was the animated film When the Wind Blows. This was based on a graphic novel by Raymond Briggs and was directed by Jimmy Murakami. It had music by David Bowie and Roger Waters. When the Wind Blows is a haunting look at a British couple trying to survive nuclear fallout. I highly recommend watching this film. And there was also another Asterisk film that came out this year called Asterisk in Britain. Then in 1987, we have the final film in the Christopher Reeve Superman series. This was called Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, and it was directed by Sidney J. Furie. It was not produced by the Salkinds, as the rights had been sold to Canon Films. Reeve was originally skeptical about reprising his role, but the producers promised that they'd fund a film of his choosing if he returned. The film, which featured Lex Luthor creating an evil clone of Superman called Nuclear Man, was quite terrible and a box office failure. This was partly due to budget problems. According to the IMDb trivia page for the movie, the budget was originally supposed to be $36 million, but was cut to $17 million because Canon Films was having money problems. This led to some pretty crappy special effects. Reeve claimed that this flick did serious damage to his career, and he was probably right. Superman 4 also did damage to the Superman franchise itself. Superman would not appear on film again until 2006 in Superman Returns, and it's worth noting that that film disregarded Superman 3 and 4, and it only considered the first two as canon. So, you know, I have not, just being honest here, I have not sat down and watched the whole Superman 4 Quest for Peace, but I've seen clips of it, and I think that's enough to know that it is pretty terrible. It's easily the worst in the series. Definitely a significant step down from Superman 3, which is saying a lot. So this film was kind of, an end of an era in two different ways. Obviously it was the end of the Christopher Reeve Superman film series. But, with the coming 2 years later of Tim Burton's Batman in 1989, this kind of, superhero films would start to branch out and be taken more seriously. Not that they weren't campy anymore, but sometimes they could be more serious, and there's definitely a different tone in Batman in a lot of the 90s superhero films when compared to the Superman series. Next year, in 1988, one of the best and most influential anime films ever made came out, called Akira. Akira was based on the epic manga of the same name by Katsuhiro Otomo. This sprawling manga ran from 1982 to 1990 and totaled over 2,000 pages. I've read it. It's a great read. I love it. I would highly suggest checking it out. Otomo also directed the anime adaptation. He actually would only allow the film to be made if he had creative control. Akira was a landmark anime, partly because of its incredible animation. It was much more detailed than most anime of the time or previously. The dialogue also was recorded before the animation was done, allowing the mouth movements to sync up with the words that were spoken. And Akira was actually one of the first anime to do this. So, for all these reasons, it was largely responsible for the international success of Japanese animation. And you actually, after this period, is when you really started seeing anime get huge in the West. There were a bunch of other films based on manga released in the 80s too. This includes several films based on the Doraemon character, and also 5 based on Dragon Ball. Other manga to be adapted were Tomorrow's Joe, Kinnikuman, Urusei Yatsura, and Fist of the North Star. Furthermore, the film Shogun Assassin was made, which was edited from footage found in the first 2 adaptations of the Lone Wolf and Cub manga. Okay, so moving on to 1989, we have this year a few small comic book films and one huge one. One of the smaller ones, which many people may not even realize exist, is The Punisher. This was actually the first Punisher movie, so it's based on the Marvel character and it starred Dolph Lundgren. The movie, it garnered mainly negative reviews. It was somewhat faithful to the comic character, but he did not wear the iconic skull logo from the comics. Also, that year there was Return of Swamp Thing and Asterisk in the Big Fight. Now that we got those out of the way, we can move on to by far the biggest comic book movie of the year, and that's Tim Burton's Batman. Just a bit of context here, the Batman character was pretty popular consistently from the 40s, his creation, until the 80s, and obviously until now. But after the 60s show and movie, he was kind of thought of as kind of this goofy thing that was, lighthearted, not very serious. But then in the 80s, and especially the mid-80s, the character had been undergoing a bit of a renaissance. Kind of was beginning to be taken more seriously again, and this was mainly due to 2 major seminal works, and that's Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's The Killing Jokes. Both of these led to new interest in making a Batman movie, and they were cited as influences on the 89 film, and I think their influence of those 2 graphic novels has been felt throughout the Batman film series. So it may seem strange now because the movie was a huge hit and the Batman series is so popular, but Batman fans were originally pretty skeptical when the film was announced. This was partly due to the choice of Tim Burton as director and Michael Keaton as Batman. At the time, Burton had only made comedies like Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Beetlejuice, and Keaton was also known for comedies such as Beetlejuice and Mr. Mom. So it's kind of understandable this led many fans to think the movie was going to be a campy parody like the 60s TV series. So this actually led the studio to quickly release a teaser trailer showing how the film was a lot darker than the 60s version, and this kind of helped a little bit. So in addition to Keaton, the cast included Jack Nicholson as the Joker, and Kim Basinger's Vicky Vale, Billy D. Williams, who you may know as Lando from Star Wars, also appeared as District Attorney Harvey Dent, which is the alter ego of Two-Face in the comics, and it was actually planned at some point to have the Two-Face plot come in, but this actually, it wouldn't end up being used on film until Batman Forever with Tommy Lee Jones, and then obviously the character was in The Dark Knight. So Batman was highly successful. It made over $400 million. This was partly due to just an unprecedented marketing bonanza. The film also won an Oscar for set direction, which makes sense, as the set direction was definitely a highlight of the film. Like many of Burton's films, it was strongly influenced by German Expressionism, including films like Metropolis and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Some interesting tidbits include the fact that Dick Grayson, aka Robin, was originally included in the script. And also, this is the only Batman film to this day with just one villain. So this film was basically just the beginning of Batman's domination. After that, there was 3 direct sequels. The Tim Burton Batman Returns, and then Batman Forever, Batman and Robin would follow, and then eventually in 2005 there was the rebooted trilogy directed by Christopher Nolan, and then the characters appearing again next year, Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice by Ben Affleck. So the film, the 89 film, was faithful to the comics in many ways, but there were also some departures. The Joker's appearance is very similar to that of the comics. Nicholson even wore a prosthetic chin to look more like the Joker. However, unlike in the comics, the Joker was the killer of Bruce Wayne's parents, not Joe Chill. The Joker also has an actual name, Jack Napier. In the source materials, the Joker's name was usually just left a mystery. Furthermore, unlike his comic counterpart, Tim Burton's Batman seems to have no problem with killing. However, this could also be considered as accurate, as Batman killed people in the earliest comics. So, if the 1978 Superman film didn't kick off the modern superhero genre, then Tim Burton's Batman definitely did. There weren't really a lot of direct imitators in the years that followed, but it's definitely had a massive influence on comic book movies. Okay, so that's all for this video. In my next one, part 4, I'll talk about the comic book films of the early 90s. Thanks for listening.